Hello, and welcome to the Anarchist Book Club with Danny Evans and me, Jim Yeoman. In a break from our usual setup, this episode features us being interviewed about the history of anarchism in Spain by Alan McGuire of the Sobremesa podcast. Sobremesa is a weekly podcast which covers subjects on contemporary Spanish society, politics and history. You can subscribe using your usual podcast app and follow the show on Twitter at SobremesaCast. This information is also in the notes to this episode. We're really grateful to Alan for inviting us on, so do subscribe to his show and support this great new podcast. Given the scope of the subject and the fact that we love talking about it, this is an extra long episode, so settle in.
Hello and welcome to the Sobremesa podcast. As always, I'm your host, Alan McGuire, and I must say this is one of the most interesting interviews that I've ever conducted. I knew the history of anarchism in Spain to a degree. I can say that I knew of anarchism in Spain and part of its history from reading many Spanish books, but often in the sort of mainstream history books about Spain's modern history, anarchism is often played down or not fully explained. So it was an absolute pleasure to interview Danny and Jim from the ABC podcast, the Anarchist Book Club podcast. And I think in this interview you get a real sense of the importance, but also the size and what it really meant for anarchism in Spain. So I hope you enjoy the episode as much as I did recording it. And don't forget to head on over to Danny and Jim's podcast, the Anarchist Book Club. I'm a listener now and it's fascinating and quite fun to listen to.
Okay, so with me today on the Sobremesa podcast, I have Danny and Jim from the ABC podcast, the Anarchist Book Club. Welcome, guys.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, nice to be here.
Thanks for joining me. Today's main topic is obviously anarchism. I suppose most of the listeners of this podcast will have come into contact or seen that, Spain as a country in itself is quite an important place for anarchists. I think most people come across the anarchism of Spain via the book Homage to Catalonia, George Orwell's famous sort of description of Barcelona under anarchist control when he gets there and, not tipping people and saying salud, not buenos dias, and, all those sorts of, it's quite a bit romanticized, maybe some might say. And then obviously the following on battle from that. And I suppose, for people that still live in Spain as well, they might see anarchism through the work that the CNT does. So I've taught at places that have had CNT representatives, and they're still a big part of modern Spain. But all these images, I just thought I would ask you basically first, a very basic question. What is anarchism, and what is the difference between anarchism and syndicate anarchism or syndical anarchism? Because I think they're both quite specific things, aren't they, in Spain? So yeah, whoever wants to take that big question on, feel free to go.
Well, I suppose we probably both got something to say about that. I don't mind saying first.
Yeah, go for it.
I suppose anarchism, the basic answer would be something along the lines of historical answer would be that anarchism is the part of the socialist movement that disagreed that the priority of socialists should be to take power in a given nation state. So developing from that disagreement, the anarchist position has been that, that social change will come about through direct action and not through engagement with state bodies. And the goal of anarchism is not to achieve a kind of transitional state that would like manage a change towards socialism, but instead the goal would be to I suppose dismantle the state and then allow socialism to flourish in the context that follows. But probably not that simple. That's like a simple answer to the question, but anarchism as a kind of umbrella term encompasses all kinds of different approaches to life and to politics that probably would exceed the bounds of a single podcast episode to answer. But I think like that kind of historical framing is useful to bear in mind for thinking about the importance of anarchism in Spanish history in particular. And anarcho-syndicalism is like one strategic element of the anarchist movement that becomes, that develops out of what was originally called revolutionary unionism at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, and which had like a good deal of support and adherence in places like the United States, Argentina, France, as well as Spain. In Spain, the main organizational manifestation of revolutionary unionism was the CNT. And because of like the anarchist influence within the CNT, that revolutionary unionism came to be called anarcho-syndicalism, largely because it became like tied specifically to the end goal of anarchists, which is libertarian communism.
Right. So just going back to your sort of original description, you say it's like not about dismantling the state. So it's more about, so it's not about standing in elections, like parliamentary elections. It's more about forming trade unions. And I think like one thing that really struck me during the COVID, here in Spain and in the UK was like mutual aid schemes. And it was a really big thing of anarchism. So the CNT, what does it stand for, and where did it start?
So yeah, Danny's pointing at me because I wrote a book on the kind of formation of the CNT, so I guess that's on me. But it stands for the Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, the National Confederation of Labour, and that emerges in sort of 1910 to 1911 as a national organisation. It actually has a precursor in Catalonia called Solidaridad Obrera, which remains a CNT newspaper as well, that title, so Workers' Solidarity. But then, depending on how far back you go, really, you can look at the origins into the 1870s, late 1860s, 1870s. As Danny said, if we're thinking about anarchism as a historical movement, a political movement, rather than, say, just a general sort of philosophical tendency against authority, which, the two can get slightly intermingled, but I think, again, it's helpful to think of it as, in this movement form. In Spain, it had always been close to the workers' movement. When you get the first international forming around Europe, the organization that Karl Marx was a part of, many kind of emerge out of this. At the start, it's a real mixture of anarchists and socialists and other kind of tendencies on the left. In Spain, that always takes a more kind of anarchist-ish sort of form, style, and so it's always quite close to organized labor. So through the 19th century, the end of the 19th century, you get various attempts to form a national union confederation. There's one in the 1880s that falls apart through disagreements. And so that desire to kind of organize through labor has been a part of anarchism in Spain since its origins. But when you get into the early 20th century, that's when these ideas that Danny said about syndicalism, they start coming into the movement, again, chiming with things that anarchists in Spain have already been doing. Now they've got a kind of, they're very inspired by what's happening in France. A big similar organization called the CGT has formed there. And so you get this nucleus of syndicalists and anarchists coming together in Barcelona.
They form Solidaridad Obrera, and then that then expands in 1910 to 11 into the CNT. Up until the First World War, it's basically repressed, and it doesn't really have an existence rather than a name. And then during the crisis that affects Spain during the First World War, you get this mass expansion of the CNT. And really, it's that kind of 1917 onwards that you're talking about a mass organization across Spain that claims, figures are always very elastic with the CNT. It's hard to pin it down. But around 1919, they claim the support of around 800,000 members. So that's when we're talking about a real national presence, a major player in Spanish politics.
And you talk about the crisis of the First World War. How did it affect Spain, and what sort of pushed this, this working class organization to be formed? What really gave it the boost? What was the crisis that came from the First World War? Because Spain weren't a part of the First World War, were they, really?
No. Spain didn't join the First World War, but like you can still imagine, it was still profoundly affected by what went on. So, in general, Spain attempts to supply both sides in the First World War. They have a huge economic boom, but then that also brings crisis. There's rampant inflation, also a real kick into urbanization. Barcelona swells in size. At this point, it's a very turbulent time, and it's a turbulent time for national politics. You have the crisis of the restoration system, which has been in place since the 1870s, so similar time to the anarchist movement. That's clearly falling apart. And then also, you get this surge in the anarchist movement. Now they go into the war, as I said, repressed, and they actually fracture in a very profound way at the start of the war about what their position on the war is. The majority, based around the CNT, adopt the kind of classic anarchist position of anti-militarism, anti-war. We want nothing to do with this. But a small minority, but an important minority, are kind of in favor of the Entente, in favor of France in particular. They kind of go along with some others in the international anarchist movement who say a victory for the Entente is preferable, and so we'll do that. So whilst this might seem a slightly obscure kind of internecine discussion, what that argument does is it puts the major figures in the movement in the same room for the first time since the CNT was founded, really, in trying to settle this difference. And they don't settle that, but what they do agree on is we need to get the CNT expanding again. And so that's when you have almost, it's a dirty word for anarchists, but it's almost a centralization or an increased centralization from where they are. The CNT starts to operate as a national body. They start to push out their newspaper as a daily publication rather than a weekly one, and that then overlaps all of the small fractured publishing culture that's going on in Spain. And this kind of coming together, I think, of crisis, of mass movement of people internal to Spain, plus the CNT kind of getting its house in order, starts to kind of meld those things together, and that's when you see the rapid expansion of the CNT.
Sorry, it might be worth also just pointing out that that this is like the beginning of where you can see like Spain as different to other, particularly European countries in terms of like the longevity of anarchism,
right,
as an organized force, because Spain is. The process that Jim's just described is like the opposite of what's happening to socialist and anarchist movements in all of the belligerent countries as a consequence of this division that's taken place with the outbreak of the First World War. And so when the Russian Revolution happens, there are like disaffected minorities within socialist and anarchist movements all around Europe that then become the sort of nuclei of communist parties. Because of the sort of increasing coherence of the CNT and because of this majority anti-war position that it's been able to adopt in the circumstances of neutrality in Spain, there isn't that constituency for the creation of a kind of Bolshevik-style party in Spain in the aftermath of the First World War. And therefore, this anarchism is able to retain a kind of majoritarian or at least like a prominent position within the workers' movement in a way that it doesn't in any other country in the world.
Wow. And where does Primo de Rivera sort of, because you know, not his son, the founder of the fascist party, but the dad, the dictator. Where does anarchism fit under this? Because my brief understanding was that he repressed the CNT. So did it balloon before or after him?
Well, it reaches like this peak of membership that Jim just talked about around 1919. This is after Spain has effectively kind of ridden out the so-called Trienio Bolchevique, like the 3 Bolshevik years, right, which is a misnomer in the sense that it wasn't 3 years or Bolshevik, right, but it was like a kind of revolutionary crisis that Spain underwent. Mm-hmm. But in the aftermath of this, there's an employers' offensive against, particularly against anarchist labor militants, and this gives rise to the years of so-called pistolerismo, where hired gunmen of the bosses' associations start a sort of tit-for-tat warfare with anarchist militants and activists. And this is where you have like the rise of the famous men of action of the CNT that would then, you know, in many respects be like the kind of blooding ground for what would become some of the key figures of the generation of 36 that would lead the revolution and war. It's also the year in which these are also this is also the period in which the great CNT leader Salvador Seguí is gunned down in Barcelona. And it's in that sort of context of crisis and gun battles and so forth that Primo de Rivera is able to present himself as a sort of figure of law and order who's going to reimpose order in Spain. That combined with the ongoing rebellion against Spanish rule in the Protectorate of Morocco. Mm. So it's that combined like problem of like colonial crisis and the sort of crisis of violence engendered by like, a radical labor movement and a very violent response on the part of the bosses that allows Primo de Rivera to come in, present himself as the sort of, you know, iron surgeon who's going to bring social peace to Spain and its protectorate. And yeah, he represses the CNT as a matter of priority. And importantly for how like Spanish politics is going to develop, the UGT, the Socialist Trade Union, are initially at least allies of Primo de Rivera, and they end his government. So thereby, you know, creating a lot of resentment and you know, and mistrust that's going to take a long time to overcome, or possibly never is overcome.
Well, and yeah, I remember reading that about the UGT. I was really surprised. And I read it in a few places, and it sort of said that they basically did it to get the membership. Like, I don't know how true that is, but was there a big shift in working class alliance between the anarchists and the socialists? And I suppose the other question is, you know, how involved were the working people as part of, you know, the anarchist sort of philosophy, or was it more of a case of collectivized action, or was it a bit of both? Do you see what I mean? Like,
yeah, so just to start on the question of the socialists, I think it's important to note that, you know, the socialist movement emerges at a similar time to the anarchist movement. It's a little bit after, and they are from the outset, you know, kind of explicitly positioned in some ways against what anarchists are doing. Like, they are very concentrated on parliamentary means, on trying to get elected. They put a lot of emphasis on that, a lot of emphasis on centralization, on kind of hierarchies. So they are almost forming in opposition to one another, and yet in many ways kind of appealing to the same groups of people. You know, I've done some work on this, and there's some existing work, at least in the early days. There isn't a massive difference in who makes up these unions. It's similar sort of trades across Spain. You know, in both movements, you see lots of tradesmen, of laborers, construction workers. Where the differences tend to lie are in geography, at least, again, in the late 19th, early 20th century. So as we said, Barcelona is this real strong point for the CNT, and then you can say Madrid really is a strong point for the UGT and the socialists. There are, you know, there are presences of each other movement in both those places, but then, you know, the north is kind of split again. Gijón in Asturias tends to be more anarchist, whereas the Basque regions tend to be more socialist. Andalusia tends to be more anarchist. You know, there are these regional variations, but it's not always apparent as to why that's the case. And I think that goes into your other point about, you know, how, you know, clued up on the philosophy of anarchism is everyone in the CNT. I would say perhaps, you know, not massively, but then there are also plenty of working class people who are in the CNT. I think it is a mixture, and people are drawn to different aspects of it. You know, some people are drawn to the philosophy, some people are drawn to the culture, some people are drawn to the real push they put on education, on gender liberation, and those kind of things. Some people, probably because the CNT is the union that organizes in their workplace, so that's the union they join. You know, I think it's not easy to pinpoint that as a particular reason for why, you know, why someone would join one than the other. Someone once said to me, after I tried to give a sort of long and labored explanation as to differences between the two movements, and he just said, well, it could be that, like, in one town the CNT had better songs, so that's where people went. So, you know, I think it's but also I wouldn't want to undermine the fact that, you know, there was a big working class interest in anarchism, and that's undeniable, and that people did know it and people did want to learn about it as well. So a bit of both is my unfortunate sort of fence-sitting answer.
No, it makes complete sense, really. And the back to like Primo de Rivera's time and his repression of the CNT, did that really alter the future for the anarchism in Spain, or not too much?
I think that's a good question. I don't know really. Lots of the key activists are forced into exile during Primo de Rivera's time. Like some of the most famous people, Durruti, García Oliver, have to get out of Spain, but also like much lesser known names as well. You know, there are whole like communities of anarchists in France, Belgium, places like that in the 1920s, setting up newspapers, setting up like prisoner support funds and things like that. So I suppose in the sense of like those kind of like support networks in exile, that's providing like experiences that are then going to have to re-emerge in the aftermath of the Spanish Civil War as well. But in terms of like how the Primo de Rivera experience impacts on the immediate like future of Spain itself, I'm not sure. I mean, I suppose a lot of it's like to do with like timing and things. So like, it creates this interlude in the 1920s, which is a time like when, say, for example, in other European countries, the communist parties are becoming like Bolshevized and things like that. I mean, to an extent, like I suppose Spain is inured from some of those kind of like some of those broader European like political developments on the left and in the Labour movement, creating like new sort of fractions and divides within the Labour movement. And I suppose the CNT kind of is able to sort of re-emerge, sort of start from where it left off in once Primo de Rivera falls. There are like, you know, the kind of subplots going on. Like, so for example, the fact that Spain is under dictatorship in this period leads the CNT into some tentative alliances with non-anarchist organizations. So there's a case of anarchists supplying explosives to Catalan nationalists. I think it's like towards the end of the 1920s. Now I'm going to get muddled up here, But they either supply explosives to Denkas or one of the Badia brothers, who then become, during the Second Republic, these kind of like archetypal figures of Catalan bourgeois law and order, and like the like #1 enemies of the CNT.
Oh.
In this period, there's a kind of like rapprochement between like figures like that, because they have this common enemy in the dictatorship. And I guess, you know, that's something that was drawn upon by figures within the CNT when trying to justify alliances with non-anarchist figures during the Civil War as well. And this does create a degree of consternation. So like during the Primo era is also when you have the foundation of the FI, which is a very important like anarchist organization, the Federación Anarquista Ibérica, which is a federation of affinity groups. And most of those, you know, the whole point of the FI basically is to try and maintain an anarchist presence within the CNT. So its principal concern, although there's a wide variety of opinion within it, I suppose the principal unifying concern is that the CNT, because of like these alliances that it's making with, say, Catalan nationalists or like Republican figures, there's a potential of its anarchist content being like diluted. So the FI exists to kind of like retain a kind of anarchist pole of attraction within the broader labor movement.
Wow.
Sorry, that seems like a pretty like long-winded kind of answer.
No, that was. And did you have something to add to that, Jim?
Just very briefly, in that I would say that whilst the Primo regime is repressive towards the anarchists, and it does, as Danny says, force people into exile, it's also relatively short, you know, in the grand scheme of things, and it's akin to other periods of repression that the movements faced before and come out of quite strongly. In a way, the movement knows what to do in a circumstance like this, when their newspapers are shut down, their unions are closed, and you know, whilst it might seem surprising perhaps that the CNT can go from strength to then being repressed under Primo and then to spring back with such strength, that's a pattern that's occurred again since the 1870s. I think that's also what marks it out from the Franco, you know, period. If you're looking for distinctions, you know, the Primo regime is 7-8 years, you know, rather than decades and decades, and it's that long-term repression, I think, that really breaks things. Whereas, you know, it's obviously a very difficult time for the movement, the 1920s, but it's not an insurmountable kind of block that is put in their path.
And I suppose the fall of Primo de Rivera brings us round to the founding of the Second Republic. So how? Because I mean, the Pact of San Sebastian between the like liberals and the socialists, because they're angry because, you know, Alfonso XIII won't sort of basically bring back any form of democracy. That's quite like a famous example of groups working together to found the Second Republic. But the anarchists are also obviously quite a big force within the Second Republic in and its formation. So what part did they play in it, and what was general like views towards the Republic?
Well, the CNT activists play like a fairly important role in something like the kind of the foundational acts of the Republic. Kind of like I suppose a sort of auxiliary supportive role. You know, CNT activists are present in Barcelona, like helping people like Luis Companys occupy, you know, his seat of regional governments and things like this. And most of the history talks about a kind of truce, or like an initial feeling of like of the CNT hoping to use this like opening of democracy in Spain to like regain its forces and sort of stabilize and consolidate itself after this period of repression. The problem is, and this is like something that Chris Elam's book Anarchism in the City really illustrates very well, is that you know, precisely the fact that like unions can return to work under the Republic means that there's a huge groundswell of interest among like ordinary people in trying to improve their life conditions. So the CNT is like it almost immediately besieged by new members who want to use the CNT to like improve their conditions of labor and so forth. And so CNT is he's pushed into lots of very big strikes, and the Republic has the choice really, to jump which way it's going to go. It has in its the first article of its constitution says the Republic is going to be a republic of all classes. It's like, well, you're not. You have to choose, and that's what really the first months of the Republic established. And they choose like any incipient state would choose. They choose to try and stabilize the situation through repressive measures against activists and so forth. And that really sort of brings about a crisis between those, I suppose, more pragmatically inclined, gradualist figures within the sort of CNT leadership, and the people who are more inclined towards revolutionary insurrection, who are hoping that this wave of worker militancy is going to generate a sort of second revolution, if you like, in the aftermath of the founding of the Republic. There are certain episodes that sort of illustrative of how this kind of initial truce with the Republic is short-lived. So, for example, in Fegols, which is a mining district in Alt Llobregat in Catalonia, the people live in labor colonies where everything is owned by the Count of Fegols. So, they get paid in tokens that are redeemable only in company stores. And, it's a kind of feudal sort of institution whereby this Count, who's a Scouser, as it happens, born in Liverpool, Count of Fegols, owns, basically controls people's life, from cradle to grave. And obviously there's an anticipation when the Republic comes about that kind of appalling situation is going to alter. And when it doesn't alter, they rise up in desperation in the beginning of 1932. But what sort of sets apart this desperate and relatively easily repressed insurrection is that this comes at a time when the CNT is already starting to fracture as a result of its, attitude towards the Republican state. But also because these workers are animated by the anarchist ideal, and very significantly, when they take over very briefly the town of Fegols, they declare libertarian communism. They raise a red and black flag. They say, okay, from this point on, we're going to abolish money. We're going to, there's going to be no more police. Let the anarchist society begin effectively. And this has a massively sort of energizing and exciting effect on anarchist activists and propagandists who who've known theoretically that that you can transform society overnight. But this sort of proves that there's an appetite among a wider working class constituency for that kind of activity. And so that really sort of, I think that I might be overstating it, but to me it seems that kind of sets the agenda then for one section of the anarchist movement, saying, okay, we can concentrate on revolutionary transformation from this point.
And that sounds like that's why, it's the praxis, the hands-on work that really sets Spain apart from other countries when it comes to anarchism. Is that true? Is there any other? Is that a big feature of why Spain is so big for anarchists?
Am I going to go for the why Spain? Yeah, I think so. I think it's kind of chicken and egg as to why Spain maintains such a strong anarchist movement into the 30s, when really elsewhere that kind of mass organized anarchist movements are tiny. As Danny said, you do get large anarchist movements elsewhere in the world in the early 20th century, really is, I would say, the First World War breaks many of those. Like the French syndicalist movement, for example, is torn apart by its decision to enter the French war effort and so on. But again, I think there is an element of, now I guess I would say this, but going back to the mid-19th century, in that there's almost like a kind of feedback loop in that, like, you know, anarchism becomes popular in Spain quite early, and then, as I kind of discussed before, it kind of embeds itself in certain areas and grows from there, and it becomes a kind of a culture that maintains itself. So yes, that sort of hands-on attitude and some of the philosophical points, you know, seem to resonate according with Spain's, the conditions of Spain, the economy of Spain, the culture of Spain. But also, it's, in a way, it's big enough in order to remain big enough. It's big enough to be able to do things which then attract members and, you know, make strikes large and so on. It's not just, you know, as you have in Britain, you know, a few people sat around saying we're the anarchist movement of Britain.
Yeah.
You know, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. So, you know, in a way, it is that kind of reciprocal kind of thing, I think, that maintains anarchism in Spain, along with the, you know, the big historical, you know, context, you know, Spain's position in the First World War, and as Danny said, Spain's experience of the 1920s with on a more national political level, which does set it apart from many other areas, which means that, you know, the same reasons which have caused the collapse of anarchism elsewhere haven't taken part in Spain, which was also in a stronger position to begin with.
Just to add to that, I mean, I agree with everything that Jim's just said, but in terms of like a kind of Spanish exceptionalism in this sense of like providing of practical examples, you could probably overstate it. I think like throughout this period, there is still like the Paris Commune still remains like a reference point, for example, for the movements in Spain. There's a famous article written by Barriano Orbon Fernandez calling for a revolutionary alliance in Spain among anarchists and socialists. And in that article, he also refers to the Bavarian Soviet Republic. So, you know, like the short-lived revolutionary government that, you know, Soviet-style government that existed in the aftermath of the First World War in Bavaria, in which anarchists and like Marxists participated together. So I think, although, like, you know, something like these kinds of like insurrections that take place in the 1930s are extremely inspiring for the anarchist movement, and sort of put libertarian communism as a specific goal on the kind of immediate agenda of the anarchist movement in Spain. I don't think that for most of the activists that I look at, they don't necessarily think of this as a uniquely Spanish kind of phenomenon themselves. You know, that they look to the history of the broader workers' movement. They look to like these other examples, and they consider themselves to be a part of that tradition.
Right. And
I think both. Sorry,
no, I was just going to ask if you could expand upon, just very briefly, what libertarian communism is for those that don't know, because it sounds like a contradictory term, but I know what it is from reading libcom.com. Very good website if anyone wants to check it out. But I just wondered if one of you would mind explaining briefly what libertarian communism is.
Yeah, so it's libcom.org actually, the website, just in case anyone wants to check it out. But yeah, so libertarian communism in Spain is the declared goal of the CNT from, I think, is it 1980 and 1919? 1918, yeah, I think. So that you know, they say that this is what we're after from and this is like in the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution, and I mean it's just another way of saying anarchist communism. I mean, libertarian is a synonym for anarchism, for anarchist in Spain, in France, in numerous other places. You know, I think it's partly, you know, it's a peculiarity of the Anglophone world, and that that people don't necessarily make that connection straight away. So yeah, so it on the one hand, it's intended to like distinguish itself from the Marxist conception of well, I mean, really, it's only that's the point of it, I suppose. Like this is something that emerges as a current of thought in the aftermath of the Paris Commune. There's a great book, Communal Luxury, by Kristen Ross, that talks about, you know, the debates in the aftermath of the Commune that lead to, like, this, I suppose, maybe codification is too much of is like an overstatement, but the kind of crystallization of certain anarchist ideas about the kind of society that they want to bring about, and the influence that the Paris Commune has had in like helping to envision that. And yes, I suppose anarchist communism is a way of saying that the classic communist goal of from each according to their ability to each according to their need would be established without a transitional state. In some ways, you know, Marx is coming to broadly similar conclusions himself in his own writings in the Civil War in France. You know, he talks about the state as a boa constrictor on the sort of communal upsurge that's taken place in Paris. But anyway, that's a bit of a tangent. So libertarian communism, as it becomes to be like understood in Spain, is a kind of is in the line of that anarchist communism that's developed in the aftermath of the Paris Commune. And there are lots of debates within the Spanish workers' movement as to exactly what it would entail. So, like, the broad understanding of it as, you know, a communist society without fixed authority, without a fixed government, without a state, is understood as like that's the basics. But, you know, how would it be organized in terms of, you know, economic coordination? What would be like the units of self-government, and you know, how would we be talking about commune, or would we be talking about you know, a union organized society? These are debates that animate the anarchist movements throughout the 1930s. And in the run up to the CNT's last Congress before the Civil War, which takes place in Zaragoza in May 1936, there's an enormous, like, unique, really, I think, in the history of the workers' movement, debate in which thousands and thousands of people, through their like local union assemblies, participate in like putting forward their vision of how libertarian communism would be. And so you get like these ideas about how like the borders would operate, how you know, Spain would like go through a reforestation process, or how like technology would be improved, or how, you know, gender relations would operate, or how like nudist colonies would function. You know, like a massive like huge swathe of different ideas, right? In some ways like mutually contradictory, in some ways you know, quite esoteric in their concerns, but nevertheless like a demonstration of the intellectual democratic culture that the CNT has been able to cultivate in Spain. And in terms of like ordinary people engaged in understanding how they could shape their own future, remains like a moving and incredibly like incredibly significant and interesting episode of history in and of itself, I would say.
Yeah, sounds it.
I just to follow on that, I taught for a couple of years a big course on the Civil War, and when trying to kind of explain where the anarchist movement is at in 1936, you know, I used this document that Danny's talking about from the Zaragoza Congress, and, you know, it always, you know, provokes really interesting discussions with students, you know, who aren't familiar with anarchism, you know, or, you know, what it's about, what it's meant to mean, you know, and I'll ask them to read this and kind of share their thoughts. And it's all, you know, I always hear something new because it's such a varied and rich document. You know, some kind of hard-headed students think that it's kind of ludicrous, you know, like, why are they talking about what to do with, as Danny says, like nudists in the future society? That isn't important on the eve of Civil War, echoing some historians who say the same thing. And then other people saying, you know, this is inspiring, or you get people saying, well, I don't know what this means. I can't, there isn't like an easy takeaway as to what anarchism wants. And in a way I have to say, well, yeah, that's kind of the point. You know, I've spent many years studying it, And it's hard to encapsulate in one small, in one little takeaway thing. It's all of these things. It's an economic model, it's a cultural model, it's a critique of gender relations, it's a worldview that encompasses so much, and that they put this down as what we need to decide, when many people knew or strongly suspected that something was coming, that a coup was coming. The movement was aware of this, and that and that they decided this is what we're going to discuss on the eve of the Civil War. I think is one of the best kind of reflections of how the movement thinks and works.
And I suppose that sort of reflects their relationship to the Republic. Could you expand upon the anarchist sort of, because I mean, there's obviously the Republic. I mean, in Spain, if you go to any left-wing protest, the Republican flag is always there, and it's sort of a bit, it's overly stated. They forget to mention that it was, liberals that were angry at the king that helped form it as well, and anarchists as well. It wasn't just this sort of, I mean, obviously it was much better than Primo de Rivera and Franco, but the dynamics within the Republic are often, I don't think, really stated clearly. So it'd be interesting to hear from you guys, what was the anarchist relationship to the Republic through all of the stages? I mean, there was the initial socialist period, and then there was like the sort of fight back from the right, and then that sort of snowballed into the Civil War. So I just wondered if you could expand upon that a bit.
I'll go briefly first, because I think Danny could speak much more on this. But one sort of takeaway of the Republican era, I think, that's always kind of stuck with me, that I learned when I started studying this, was, the narrative of the right in Spain during the Republican years is that it's a left-wing project that is out to get them. But if you actually look at the history of the Republic, the Republican state constantly is attacking to the left. It's constantly, knocking the anarchist movement on the head.
Right.
And I think there are moments of potential goodwill and, acceptance, that, perhaps this is a lesser of two evils, but I don't think that, I think that they're also very much shaped by the experience that the Republic is constantly beating left. And that comes as much from the Republican kind of centrist elements of the Republic and the socialist movement, which does use the state apparatus to try and undermine the anarchist movement, undoubtedly, and to take some of its membership. So I think often, as you say, in a way, the experience of the Civil War gets written back into the Republic, and so the anarchists are often kind of incorporated into that Republican kind of world. But and it's not totally wrong, I don't think, to see it that way. There's definitely overlap, there's definitely some shared purpose, but also it is important to outline that it is, to me anyway, that's how I see it. The Republican state is used to repress the left more than it is the right in this period.
Dan, have you got anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I think that what Jim said is correct. I mean, there's so many different things that you could talk about in terms of like the Republican years and the anarchist movement. It's like one possible way to think about it is that the Republic in its birth opens up this possibility of change and transformation. For some people within the anarchist movement, that possibility for change is like limited to the organizing possibilities opened up by democracy, like so being able to re-establish themselves as a union, as I kind of before. And for others, it's like maybe this is the opening of a kind of revolutionary period in Spanish society that we're going to be able to take advantage of and push as far as possible. But in the context of the 1930s, and also in the context of the intransigence of the right in Spanish society in opposing the kind of reforms of the Republic's first couple of years, that perspective shifts towards a kind of where does the anarchist project sit in relation to this spectre of fascism that's like looming large in Europe and in Spain as well. And I suppose there's a divergence between people who want to prioritize an alliance in that respect, in that regard, with like other non-anti-fascist forces, and others who look to, say, the experience of Germany and say, well, look, Germany shows that it's quite, it's a relatively simple process for a parliamentary democracy to transform itself into a fascist dictatorship. There's a lot of like writing about Spanish anarchist movement that tends to, precisely because the anarchist movement wasn't really a movement of educated intellectuals. It was like worker autodidacts for the vast majority. But that doesn't mean that they didn't have like insightful, interesting things to say about what's happening, not just in Spain, but abroad as well. But I think partly for that reason that that element of Spanish anarchism tends to be denigrated. Right. But if you look at like the anarchist press in the aftermath of the Nazi rise to power, there's, I think, quite insightful analysis saying that we can't rely on people to our right, like non-revolutionary forces, to provide a bulwark against fascism. Like, look what's happened in Germany. They've voted. Like Hitler is like put into power by this like deal with the old guard kind of powers within Germany, which also obviously have their equivalents within Spain as well. We're not able to rely on anyone but ourselves and our own forces. Also, you have like at the beginnings of, I don't know how influential this is, but you also have like some German refugees coming into Spain from this point as well, some of whom are anarchists, some of whom are in contact with the CNT and explaining their situation. And like one of the things you really get from the revolutionary movement in Germany, and its like reflections, particularly like those outside of like the socialist and Stalinist parties, was that they had all these like organized workers, but they were never given an opportunity to actually fight. The people just went off to like these like whole like neighborhoods that were like really strongly revolutionary in terms of like their composition, and yet they were just put down in a really like depressing kind of way. The anarchists see that happening and say, well, that can't happen here. If we're going to go down, we have to go down with a fight. And that animates like things like the abstention campaign in the elections of 1933, and the general like sort of slogan of fascism or social revolution. Like saying that we're not going to be able to save ourselves through democracy, through like alliances. We can only do it through revolution. But there are like nuanced positions within that sort of broader divide that perhaps it would be tedious and pedantic to go through. But it's very difficult to like encapsulate the entirety of the like anarchist relationship with the Republic in that sense, but probably we could maybe split it up into those kind of like, at least in terms of that periodization, like on the one hand, like what does the Republic as an opportunity represent, and then what does the rise of fascism as a threat represent, and how are we best disposed to combat it.
How does the anarchist movement respond to the Franco coup?
In Barcelona, the CNT has been, certain activists within the CNT, particularly García Oliver, and people around him in the affinity group Nosotros, which included people like Francisco Escaso and Buenaventura Durruti, like they were known as the three musketeers of Spanish anarchism.
Right.
They've been very involved in setting up what were called defense committees. And in the first couple of years of the CNT's existence, the Spanish Republic's existence, the defense committees have been at the forefront of insurrections that had taken place, particularly those that bookended the year 1933. So like The one in January 1933 that ended with the massacre in Casas Viejas. Mm-hmm. The one at the end of 1933 that came after the election victory of the right. So the defence committees have been prominent there, and the defence committees in that sense were really the inheritors of the tradition of the action groups that had fought in the years of Pistolarismo. They were like quite like a sort of semi-coordinated network of activists, but which operated with a degree of autonomy and what have you. After this experience, and with the threat of fascism looming, there's an attempt to give these bodies greater coordination and like to organize them more specifically with an eye on the possibility of a coup. And in Barcelona, it appears at least, and this is something that Agustín Guillamón has written about a great deal, and which you can read in English in the book Ready for Revolution, which he published with AK Press, which I'd highly recommend. He makes the case, which I think is pretty convincing, that in Barcelona, at least, the defense committees had managed to turn themselves from this like more or less incoherent band of action groups into a more coordinated sort of rapid response like units who were broadly speaking prepared for the coup and ready to go into action. And indeed, in the immediate like days preceding the soldiers leaving their barracks in Barcelona on the 19th of July, there are posts, people posted around the city, keeping an eye on barracks, in constant communication with one another. There are CNT activists in the taxis union going back and forth between different positions, where people's houses and also cafes where activists are stationed. Like a union headquarters and things like that, keeping in touch with everybody, so that when the soldiers do leave, they're ready to go into action. And it's an incredible operation that takes place in Barcelona. When you think that like an army going into a city, or battalions going into a city to take over, I don't think has ever been successfully resisted. I don't think there are many examples of that being in history of that being resisted by a self-organized response on the part of the working class, or like it's organizations. But that's effectively what happens in Barcelona, particularly through the initiative of the CNC and its defense committees. For example, there's somebody, Julián Merino, who's not as well known as he should be, who's an important activist in the CNC Transport Union. Him and his another activist in the same union, Juan Yagüe, lead a raid on 2 boats stationed in the Barcelona harbour, and distribute arms that they find on the boats to activists in the anarchist youth organisations in the days preceding. Anyway, so the CNT defence committees are able to show the army that they've got a fight on their hands, like within hours of their leaving the barracks. And that really presents, an opportunity for other sympathetic forces within the city, to join up. And, within a couple of days of street fighting, the army is defeated. And now, like lots of historians look back on it and say, well, it's because the CNT, it's only in those cities where security forces and, elements of the security forces join with the unions that the coup is repressed. And where that doesn't take place, the coup is successful. And, with that reading, trying to like put a lot of protagonism back onto the security forces. But I think that really misreads the situation, because, without the initiative of the workers' organisations, and this is the case in every city where the coup fails, right? Without initiative and bravery and sacrifice of the workers' organisations in taking a lead in fighting fascism, there is no choice for the security forces to make, right? That is that bridgehead that they establish that allows like members of the security forces who are more sympathetic to, who don't want a fascist takeover, that gives them the opportunity to go and, like, you know, to present themselves and to put their arms at the disposal of the people resisting the coup. You know, without that initiative, in places where it doesn't happen, in places where the CNT and or the UGT are trusting that the authorities are taking care of the situation. You know, places like Granada, Zaragoza, Oviedo. You know, that's where it's lost, right? It's in that moment, those like that day of delay, of trusting in the authorities, where the situation becomes irrecoverable, or at least, you know, that's my reading of it. And, you know, in Barcelona, at least, you know, but I think this is also true in Malaga and other places as well, Gijón. There's no doubt in the minds, in the aftermath of what's happened, there's no doubt in anyone's mind, like friend or foe, that it's the CNT, it's the workers' organizations that have taken the lead here, that have the protagonism in the situation, and who hold in their hands the fate of the society.
Well, that was brilliantly put. Thank you. And so I'm taking the story that most people will know, which will be like Orwell's Homage to Catalonia. I think it's probably one of the most famous books about the Spanish Civil War, and probably one of the most read. But in the book, later on, he sort of talks about fights between the Republic and anarchism. Is this something that happens after they realize the coup from Franco has sort of failed its initial goals, which was, you know, a quick takeover in all the major cities? Or is it something that gradually happens? Like, how does this come about over the rest of the country, not just in Barcelona, really?
So, just to follow on from Danny as well, you know, again, the drive coming from the workers' movement. I think, you know, one of the best pieces of writing I've read on that moment isn't actually about, strictly speaking, the anarchists. It's about the UGT in Madrid, where a similar dynamic is going on. And Arturo Barea's The Clash, I think that there's this fantastic couple of chapters where, you know, around the moment of the coup, which I advise anyone to read his books anyway. But that moment where basically you've just got the working class of Madrid clogging the streets around the socialist headquarters, the Casa del Pueblo, crying out for arms. You know, I think he leaves you in no doubt as to where the coup is being put down in cities like Madrid, Barcelona. You know, it's coming from the people. And yes, you know, elements of the security forces and army get on board, but that drive is there. However, like in other cities in Spain, the CNT isn't dominant. I mean, perhaps in Gijón, that has its own particular, you know, story in the Civil War. You know, many of the militia columns that are formed in Asturias are actually sent off to go and fight on the Madrid front, which is seen as the critical front early in the war, which it is. And then the formally kind of declared loyal security forces just turn around and say, no, actually, we're with the coup. So you get, you know, so while CNT strength in Gijón is there, actually many of them then shortly leave the city. Elsewhere, the CNT is often a minority position, and they end up, you know, we don't get what you get in Barcelona, which is CNT dominance of the political apparatus, basically, or, you know, the potential to control the state. It's more of a case that they end up in committees, mixed committees, still prevalent, still strong, you know, in Madrid and you know, other areas. But I don't think they don't have the opportunity to enact the wholesale, widespread social transformations that you see in Barcelona and then into Aragon, in the kind of the hinterland of the anarchist revolution during the Civil War. So I think, I mean, and there is still inter-republican violence in these other areas, absolutely. Some of which is in Madrid, is kind of dampened by the pressing threat of the war, which, you know, comes to Madrid in the autumn of 1936. So whilst the coup is kind of initially successful in about 1/3 of Spanish territory, you get the Army of Africa, led by Franco, marching through Andalusia, another heartland of anarchism. You know, the kind of areas like Cadiz, Sevilla, you know, they fall quite quickly to this march of the Army of Africa up to Madrid. And, you know, you do get this incredibly famous and important resistance in Madrid in November 1936. You know, you talk about George Orwell romanticizing Barcelona. Well, many other kind of romantic tales have been told of the siege of Madrid as well, where you do get, you know, it is incredible. You have the UGT there, you have the international brigades arriving, you know, in the nick of time to plug and advance. You have Durruti leading his anarchist militias down from Zaragoza, and that's kind of seen as, you know, that's used as a symbol for the remainder of the war of Republican unity. But what Republican unity means, in effect, in many places, is the crushing of the revolution and either the assimilation of anarchists into the re-emerging state apparatus, or violence against those that are trying otherwise. And I'll hand over to Danny to talk about the specifics of Barcelona.
Okay. Yeah, I think just to add to that, like, I think if there hadn't been a revolutionary situation in Catalonia and Aragon in the Civil War, the transformations that took place in the rest of the Republican zone would still be remarkable, and I think would still like merit the term revolution. If you think about like collectivizations that took place in the countryside in Castile and in Andalusia as well, you know, remarkable. Socialization of some industries in Valencia, you know, the levels of like worker control, and particularly like in terms of public order, which is like where the big conflict comes in Madrid after the successful resistance of the nationalist push in November 1936. You know, it's hard to describe a situation as, you know, it's not business as usual, is it, when workers with weapons are controlling like traffic and things like that on the streets. And that's something that's not confined to Catalonia and Aragon by any means. But that is where, you know, as Jim said, the anarchist predominance is such that the revolution and its fate is very much tied up with the anarchist organization, and particularly the CNT itself. So, as Jim said, you know, the anarchist organizations have entered like these ad hoc anti-fascist committees with other organizations in the first days of after the coup. But there is no effort made to like suppress governmental institutions or organizations. And the general like sort of logic behind that is that if you know, a sort of skeletal governmental structure is left in place, that might be able to persuade, you know, say Britain and France and places like that to, you know, to do business with the Republic, and, you know, some kind of like subsisting governmental structure would be required for that kind of for those kind of arrangements, which, you know, it turns out is pie in the sky, right? Because Britain and France don't offer that kind of support. But in any case, that kind of logic then, you know, takes on its own kind of momentum in terms of like justifying a rolling back of the revolution and a reconstruction of the Republican state, which is also argued is required in order to centralize the militias and transform them into a modern conventional army. So like there's a logic and an argument there. On the ground, what it means is that, you know, you have forces that have been minority forces, particularly in Catalonia, trying to reestablish themselves, and are growing basically as counter-revolutionary parties. You know, that's their appeal to people, right? That we want to push back the revolution. We want to allow you to make profits again. You know, we want to allow you to trade at market value and things like this, as opposed to, you know, have your like prices dictated by workers' organizations. And there's a lot of like sort of pretty nasty and racialized anti-working class and anti-non-Catalan migrant kind of invective like tied up in these kinds of political processes. And it's also tied up with re-establishing a traditional form of law and order on the streets, and obviously that comes into conflict with the workers' patrols that have been establishing a sort of anti-fascist order, if you like, on the streets of not just Barcelona, but in lots of places throughout the Republican zone. But it's in Barcelona in particular where that the return of like traditional police forces is most resisted, and that's where it becomes most fractious. And gradually this, with several other factors as well, builds into a situation that culminates in the May Days, which is so memorably described by Orwell as an eyewitness in 1937.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose the Communist Party, Stalin has a big impact upon the Republic. Is that really one of the sort of deciding factors that really pushes back against the anarchists during the Civil War?
I mean, well, the Communist Party in Spain was very small before the Civil War. It was, I don't think it was even bigger than the POUM, which was the party whose militia that George Orwell joined, arrived in Spain. I might be wrong about that, but I think it's not much bigger, the Communist Party, if it is bigger. And the POUM is like a dissident communist, anti-Stalinist Marxist party. In the rest of Europe, those tend to be much, much smaller than the Communist Party. In Spain, they're comparable because the Communist Party is relatively small. And Spain is not really on the Soviet Union's radar. There isn't even a Soviet embassy in Madrid or anything in 1930. Right. But the decision of the Soviet Union to start providing aid to Spain, or selling arms to Spain, obviously it's not disinterested aid, but to start trading with the Spanish Republic, October 1936, and the simultaneous organisation of the international brigades through the Comintern, through the international communist parties, completely changes the sort of level of prestige that the Communist Party is able to enjoy within Spain. But the fact that the Communist Party is positioning itself as the party against the revolution, right? Effectively, is the party that wants to re-establish order. It's the party that wants a conventional army. It makes these kinds of arguments, which are present anyway in the broader sort of state apparatuses and within some elements of the Socialist Party and the UGT bureaucracy and things like that. But it turns all of those kind of arguments, they're even present to a degree within the CNT itself, and it turns them into a kind of organizational banner for itself that says, okay, if you are against the revolution, if you think we've got to stop messing about with these kind of revolutionary experiments, and the party's over, we're going to get back to normal and fight this war to the bitter end, then join the Communist Party. And that's its kind of organizational dynamism. But in practice, that persuasive and seductive argument that sounds like common sense, in fact, it ends up, I would argue, creating a lot of unnecessary conflict within, or maybe not unnecessary, but it creates conflict in the Republican zone, and in particularly in Catalonia, where opposing the revolution means effectively returning to a free market in things like food and supplies, is actually detrimental to the war effort and doesn't involve the kind of centralization that even normal democratic capitalist states employ to fight wars in the modern period. It involves an atomization. So that appeal to the non-revolutionary forces in somewhere like Catalonia means appealing to, empowering grocers or empowering cattle traders. It doesn't. It's not that's not the social constituency that's going to win you a war, right? Let's not how it's understood, in terms of like mobilization for total war and modern war. You need to control food supplies, like it's a basic. I'm not so like the Communist Party policy, right? Although it sounds like persuasive, and even like in a film like Land and Freedom, the Ken Loach, which presents a pro, emotionally it's pro-revolution, right? The story that the individual goes through and his relationships that he makes with revolutionary militias, you're persuaded that on an emotional level that to support the revolution when you watch that film. But the way that the arguments are expressed, right? And he has this fantastic scene where these arguments are laid out as people discuss whether to collectivize land in the aftermath of a battle. In the cold light of day, those arguments that the non-revolutionaries are putting in that context sound more persuasive, I think. I've done it as an experiment, like show this to students out of context, this scene, and say, well, who do you think's more convincing? And they always say, the non-revolutionaries. But that's because, I would argue that the argument's put in emotional terms, but it can be put in rational terms, that when you've got a revolutionary situation, it makes more sense to build on that and to use its like resources as best you can, rather than, put so much resources into like defeating that situation in order to then, try and establish from nothing, basically, a conventional war effort against an enemy that has, all of the advantages in the terms of fighting a conventional war. Anyway, that's kind of like getting into sort of historical debates, but that's the kind of thrust of the Communist Party argument. That's the sort of basis for its support, but particularly in Catalonia, a lot of that support also comes from a more instinctive or traditional hatred of the leveling socialistic aspirations of the working class and its organizations.
It's a really interesting way to put it, actually. It's because I've always heard the mainstream narrative, really, and it's like, but when you put it in practical terms, like trying to reestablish a whole state apparatus and a society during the middle of a war that's already gone through the steps of revolution and has reestablished itself. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I can see exactly where you're coming from, really.
Yeah, just a short thing. I had a similar experience in teaching the Civil War. Is again, it's the kind of hard-headed student. We have this image of students of being like kind of radicals and things. I've found that in seminars, it's usually me that's pushing a more radical line, and they say, yeah, of course the socialists and the communists, they have the right idea. This is sensible. You've got to have order. You've got to raise the war properly. And I find myself saying to them, it's like, I don't mean to spoil the ending, but this didn't work. And that like Britain and France didn't end up sending any substantial aid to the Republic. And what happens after the revolution is kind of defeated on the streets in May 37, is a slow grinding conventional war that the Republic was probably always going to lose. So it's, the kind of hard-headed rationalism, because they present themselves, the communists, as the rationalist, the sensible way to do things. That seems to have appeal, and I think that was its appeal at the time. Just another small point on the communists role in the May Days and things. I think this is something that Danny has stressed as well in his work. Whilst it's important to recognize what they're doing, and it definitely is important, and it's definitely dynamic. I think that's a key word that Danny used there. They're not alone, and there is a narrative of the kind of insidious Communist Party betraying the revolution, doing kind of Stalin's bidding from afar, like the puppet master. There's hints of that in Orwell, and it's in quite a lot of anarchist literature, and also a lot of post-Civil War, kind of Cold War history as well. You see this kind of the nefarious influence of the Soviet Union. Just to lay out that there is that there, and they definitely have a role in a lot of the violence, particularly violence directed against anarchists and the POUM. But they're not alone. This is a view that's shared by lots of other sectors of the republic. You know, like it's definitely what the Catalan bourgeoisie want. It's, you know, the judiciary, the military apparatus of Spain. You know, they all, you know, this isn't a Stalinist plot to betray the brave revolutionaries, or it's not just that. You know, there's plenty of forces that want to see the end of anarchist power in Catalonia. And yeah, the communists are a dynamic part of that, but they're not doing it alone.
Yeah, I think that's important to stress. And probably by making these kind of arguments, I'm not trying to say that had the revolution not been crushed, then a different outcome would have occurred in the war. That's not what we're trying to posit. It's just to show some of the contradictions and problems of this, as you say, conventional mainstream sort of supposedly common sense kind of point of view that you hear a lot.
No, it's definitely true. And it's certainly a phase that's, I think, Spain's going through at the minute. Living here, you sort of hear a lot of history being challenged, from the Civil War to the transition and all sorts of things. How did the anarchists respond to the defeat in the war? How did the war end, and how did the anarchists sort of respond, and what was the sort of end of the war like for the anarchists?
Well, like for all of the Republican sectors, it's extremely bitter, and you know, for lots of them, you know, it ends as badly as anything could have feasibly end. You know, in arrest, torture, death. I suppose the anarchists play a role in the actual denouement of the war, in the sense that the CNT in Madrid in particular supports the Casado coup, which leads to the deposition of Juan Negrín, who'd been the prime minister from the May Days up until that point, like March 1939, and anarchist units under the commander Cipriano Mera fight against communist units to reinforce the Casado coup. You know, the logic of the Casado coup, yes, the logic of the Casado coup being that if we get rid of the communists out of the Spanish government, then perhaps Franco will be more willing to show mercy with the Republic. You know, it was pie in the sky. There was no real basis for thinking that, and it proved completely false. But I think, you know, and the current trend of history is very pro Negrín and very, very anti Casado. But I think, in terms of just understanding the anarchist point of view here, you know, the anarchists had felt, and rightly so, I think, that they had compromised on everything to try and retain a level of unity in the Civil War, and that they had given the best of their people to that battle. You know, I've read somewhere that 60% of the people who fought for the Republic in the Battle of the Ebro, you know, a last desperate, doomed throw of the dice in which thousands and thousands of people's lives are thrown away. You know, 60% of those were CNT members.
Wow.
You know, and this is after any kind of influence that the CNT had, you know, within the Republican zone has been utterly pushed aside. And so Negrín's exhortations, you know, which were basically pure rhetoric, right? To say that we will resist, we will continue resisting. But, you know, he's saying this while supposedly trying to arrange evacuations and things like that, which is not in itself a bad strategy. But because he's famously doing everything on his own and not communicating to any sort of other allies or other organizations, there's a great deal of suspicion about what it is that he's up to, and whether there's going to be privileged escape routes for communists and his friends in the Communist Party, as opposed to, you know, the broader Republican allies. So there's a lot of suspicion, and also this rhetoric about resistance, when it comes down to it, it's particularly when we're talking about like the defense of cities, right, which is what ultimately a kind of last-ditch resistance would have amounted to had it been employed. The possibility of that kind of what was called Numantian resistance, right? The sinews of that, the possibilities of that being mobilized had been completely destroyed by precisely the kind of counter-revolutionary activity that Negrin had spearheaded. You would need to rely on precisely those kind of worker mobilizations that only really the CNT was in a position to try and initiate. So there's no faith in that kind of rhetoric, and also there's by this point there's no trust at all between the CNT and the communists within the military as well. For lots of like quite complicated reasons. So the CNT involves itself in that episode, which is a squalid episode, right? I think we can say that brings the war to an end. Unnecessary in the sense that it didn't change anything in terms of the outcome, and which left a lot of people dead, right? But that doesn't gain for the CNT any kind of advantage whatsoever in the sense of like being able to escape. Most of the key figures of the Casado coup who wanted to left Spain before Franco arrived, before Madrid fell. But by people like Maximo Franco, like anarchist, very young anarchist militant who had been fighting in the war from the beginning, fought in the May Days in Barcelona as well. He was involved in those kind of operations against the Communist Party. He's there with thousands of others in Alicante, the rat trap, waiting to see if any ship is going to come and take them out of the inferno that's awaiting them. Suffering from like aerial bombardments, just waiting for the Italian army to come. And there's an extremely like moving episode recounted in the 80s Granada documentary, the Spanish Civil War, which is entirely available on YouTube. Really recommend it. The last episode, they talk about this. They talk to anarchists who were there in Alicante, and who spent, in this last. They talk about this last example of wartime anarchist democracy, and its assembly is held to decide whether they should commit suicide or whether they should allow themselves to be taken away by police. And several people did, including Maximo Franco, commit suicide, right? Looking out into the sea and saying, "This is our last gesture against fascism." So utterly tragic. And lots of others managed to get over the border into France, particularly with the fall of Barcelona. Something like 80,000 CNT members were in France after the fall of the civil wars, and experienced for the most part the awful conditions of the refugee camps, the hunger, the humiliations, and then all of the privations that came with Nazi occupation. Many fought in the resistance as well, and it's I suppose it's another story, but again a story with a lot of testament to the ongoing humanity, commitment to culture, commitment to education of the anarchist movement. I mean, just one example would be somebody called Herman Algracia, who later wrote under the pen name Victor Garcia. He was 16, I think, when the Civil War broke out in Barcelona. A member of the CNT already, a member of an anarchist affinity group called Los Quijotes del Ideal, so the Quixotes of the ideal, a classic kind of somebody who had not had an education, been to work from a very young age, but who had educated himself and was committed to self-education as a result of his involvement in the anarchist movement. In France after the Civil War, experiences the refugee camps, links up with the French resistance, is then captured, is interned initially, I think, in France, but is then put on a wagon in 1944, headed to Dachau, and manages to escape by pulling up the planks of wood on the like provide the floor of the wagon and like rolling out from underneath it. And if you like hear about Daco in the final months of the Second World War, you know, he was heading towards extermination. It's absolutely appalling. So by the skin of his teeth. But in that period, in those succession of camps that he's been involved in, he's helped produce newspapers. He's learned Esperanto. He's learned. He's been practicing French, practicing English, and you know, all throughout the rest of his life, he's committed to anarchist publications, to correspondence, to, you know, keeping up the flame of this, of not just like the anarchism as a movement, but as a sort of ethical approach to life and to human interaction that is just testament to the human spirit, I think.
Wow. Sorry, go on, Jim.
I was just going to add, just in a kind of broad sense, you know, this is a very rich and tragic story that Danny's played out. I mean, this plays out for many, you know, thousands of individuals, this experience of catastrophe, of defeat, of exile, of internment in camps. And it leads the movement, I think, in the following decades, you know, not only to be split between those that have remained in Spain and those that are in exile, but also just an obsession, an understandable and you know explainable obsession, but of looking back at these moments that we've been discussing and you know, and playing them out again, you know, thinking of 1936, you know, what did we do right and what did we do wrong? What happened in 1937 with the May Days? Who is to blame? What's responsible? What was the right position? And I think you do get a generation, again, understandably, because they are locked out of Spain in you know, many of them literally, you know, they can't return, or you know they can't participate in public life, those that are in Spain as anarchists anyway. You know, the war becomes in a way almost frozen in the anarchist imaginary. Yeah, so I think, you know, like I said, understandably, you know, it remains a point of contention within the movement that it's very difficult to move on from, I think, for many people, and I think that continues throughout the Franco period.
Right. And how did the anarchists, like, what happened to the movement under Franco, under his dictatorship until sort of the 1970s?
Well, you have a succession of like committees formed in the underground that are unable to sustain themselves, and which are detained, tortured, imprisoned, murdered. You know, you name it. That's the essential story of the early days of the underground in Spain, with the like a couple of years exception of the thaw that happens in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, where Franco is worried about you know, the United Nations coming for him, essentially. So there is like a brief period where it appears, you know, that anarchists are able to organize a bit more freely. Some people are released from prison, but this, you know, it doesn't last long. Once it's become clear that that, you know, there aren't going to be any like consequences for the Franco regime as a result of the Allied victory in the Second World War, you know, it goes back to being extremely repressive in terms of the anarchist movement. Then the anarchist movement in Spain becomes also so disconnected from the movement in exile. There's a split. Somewhat disingenuously, some of the like leading figures of the anarchist movement who had like led the process of collaboration with the Republican state during the Civil War in exile revert to a kind of anarchist purism and say, you know that we were wrong to have collaborated, and from now on we're going to like chart a very orthodox kind of anarchist cause, and everyone has to get on board with that. In Spain, in the underground, perhaps understandably in very different conditions, and the thinking is that, you know, we need to make alliances wherever we can. In some cases, you know, as the years go by, that does lead to some pretty dodgy connections that, you know, understandably the anarchist movement elsewhere would wish to distance themselves from. But initially, like the way it's handled and everything is leaves a lot of people disenchanted, leaves a lot of people burnt out, I think both within and outside of Spain. And because of that, like kind of the consequences of those kind of splits, I think, makes anarchism less attractive as a sort of to a younger generation, basically. This is something that, you know, the older anarchist exiles lament quite frequently in their correspondence with one another, particularly as you get into like sort of 50s and 60s, that they haven't been able to bring up a new generation of anarchists. And this is a problem, like when the transition does come about, and you have like this resurgence of interest in anarchism that is genuine and leads to a very rapid growth again of the CNT in the immediate, like early transitional years. But you have this problem of that new impetus for anarchism coming partly through, like, you know, a lot through like worker struggles, but also partly through the counterculture and how those worker struggles interacted and overlapped in some senses with, you know, countercultural influences related to music, sexuality, and so forth, and which were much harder for the old guard to get on board with. And you didn't have like a kind of intermediary generation, basically, to sort of negotiate that. I mean, like, just perhaps it sounds like superficial or facile, but like if you just think about like music, right? Most of the people I investigate, you know, research into, who were active in the 1930s, all their life they listened to classical music. You know, they all love Beethoven, and they love like zarzuelas, you know, like the kind of Spanish, like sort of version of opera. And that's what they listen to. Now, okay, it's not a big thing, is it? Like what kind of music? It's just a matter of taste, potentially. But if you then go to the kind of like music that people are listening to in the mid to late 70s, there isn't even a rock and roll generation, right, or an R&B generation to kind of bridge that, like to like sort of be sort of understandable to people. But you think like trying to explain like punk to a granddad without a Beatles dad, do you know what I mean? Or without, and I think that you can sort of expand that musical analogy to everything else as well, to every other sphere of life, you know, like to politics and to working practices, to sexuality. You know, there isn't a bridge, basically. And that's not the only reason by any means that the CNT is unable to like build on that initial growth in the transition period. You know, there's some really dodgy state activity going on as well. But I do think that, you know, that's a big problem. I mean, you've got like the famous like libertarian days in around Montjuic in Barcelona, in like, I can't remember what year it is, but like maybe it's 77, in the mid to late 70s anyway. And you've got like elder statesmen coming back from France to deliver like these speeches, like very moving speeches about, you know, what they've been through and everything, and what, you know, how important it is to see like the resurgence of anarchism in Spain and what have you. And these are people whose approach to life is often quite morally puritanical, right? A lot of them are abstemious. You know, they don't. A lot of them don't. You know, they don't believe in marriage, but they don't believe either in a sort of frivolous approach to sexuality. I don't know if that makes me sound like an elderly person as well. Anyway, you know, they're like, when they talk about like say free love, you know, what they mean is like love, right? They have like a real belief in like sentimental attachment. And when, you know, when they go and do these speeches, like they head off back home, and there are people like having sex outside, like in the gardens and what have you, you know, who see like anarchism as being about letting it all hang out, you know. That kind of countercultural sort of approach to anarchism. And it's nothing to do with it, you know. To them, it's nothing to do with that. That is to them, that is not what anarchism is about or has ever been about. And sort of making that, like, allowing that dialogue to happen would have required, I think, like an intermediary that didn't exist.
And so, I mean, quite often regarding the transition, just talk about transition briefly, the Communist Party is sort of seen as I suppose, like the main underground party, and Comisión Obreras, it's like, I suppose now it's the biggest union in Spain. It's sort of the communist union that formed out the Communist Party following the transition. They both play quite a big part in the transition politically, I suppose, like with making deals with the Moncloa Pacts, for instance. How did the anarchists respond to that?
Well, the CNT opposed the Moncloa Accords, understandably. If anarchism was to have any kind of independent existence in Spain, I think it needed to do that. I think in some ways the fact that the Communist Party were involved in the Moncloa Accords, the fact that the Communist Party, as you say, was very associated with the transition, the various pacts that allowed the transition to take place in the way it did, retention of the monarchy, amnesty laws and what have you, that really gives an opportunity for anarchism and for the CNT to be, the oppositional voice there, I think, that's critiquing that managed transition. And it's very difficult, isn't it? I don't want to sound like I'm criticizing basically an organization that for its strategic, for the strategic decisions that people took in a situation that was very very different to anything I've done myself, right? But I think also that kind of also it's as well, I should say, it's not an area that I've studied in great depth either. But it's unable to become a sort of focal point in that sense, right? That's able to provide a moral, libertarian, and revolutionary alternative to the Pax of Moncloa. There are various reasons for that. Partly because of internal splits within the organization itself, which I've alluded to, but which also recurred with regard to industrial strategy, ultimately leading to the split that, the CGT, the foundation of the CGT and the CNT as separate organizations. The Scala bombing, which led to which was probably an inside job that led to a police crackdown on anarchists. Which sorry, so I shouldn't say probably have been an inside job. It certainly wasn't an inside job in the sense of employees of the Scala being involved or anything like that. So sorry, I shouldn't have used that term. But may well have been police infiltrators who actually carried that out. In any case, led to a sort of a further crackdown on anarchism. So this swelling of anarchism that comes about, I think, through people hearing about anarchism for the first time, associating it with this incredible revolutionary history and becoming interested, becoming involved. The stakes involved in becoming interested in anarchism were raised much higher, partly by the real sort of bitterness of these internal disputes, which often led to violence themselves, and also because of the possibility of serious police repression as well. All of which served to effectively marginalize anarchism in Spanish society. Although, as you mentioned right at the beginning of our conversation, anarchism has retained a presence in Spain probably to a greater extent than any other country in Europe. I mean, I think that's probably true.
I'd agree with that. I mean, I've not been, obviously I've spent more time in Spain than I have in most other countries, but I think there's definitely that cultural historical legacy that people are aware of. Even just in the basic way, the symbolism of anarchism in the CNT, has meaning in Spain that I think it doesn't have elsewhere. But I think, again, going back to where we started and the kind of origins and the kind of heyday, you know, it's a very long way from that, you know, that we talked about that strong presence and link in the working class. You know, this made sense on a very sort of day-to-day level that I don't think you could say that exists, but the legacy of that remains important in Spain to a degree that I don't think you see elsewhere.
No, I mean, from living here, you can just see it. You know, I think in most towns you can see, you know, a sort of a sparkle of anarchism, or there's always like a famous story of anarchists, you know, striking, or, you know, during the war, or like through all the different periods of modern Spanish history, really. So thank you very much for informing us, guys. That was brilliant. I understand you both have books out. What are they called? What are they on? And who publishes them?
Well, my book, so this is Danny Evans speaking. My book is called Revolution in the State, and it's, you know, you'd want the cheaper paperback version, which is out with AK Press.
And yeah, my book out with Routledge, unfortunately not particularly cheap, but at academic prices, is Print Culture and the Formation of the Anarchist Movement in Spain. And yeah, if people have difficulty accessing that, they can always get in touch with me directly.
Brilliant. Thank you very much both for coming on Sobremesa. It's been an absolute pleasure.
No worries, Alan.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
And don't forget to listen to their podcast. Is it every month, or is it
about 3-week turnaround we have?
Brilliant.
Yeah,
brilliant. Okay, thanks guys.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thanks for listening. As ever, you can follow the podcast on Twitter and Facebook, both at ABC Danny and Jim, and get in touch via our email, abcwithdannyandjim@gmail.com. And do check out the Sobremesa podcast using your podcast app and their Twitter handle @SobremesaCast. That is SOBREMESACAST. The podcast music is Stealing Orchestra, Gente de Miña Tierra. The podcast logo is an adapted version of the Left Book Club logo. And the image in this episode is a poster by Josep Obiols for the collectivised transport industry of the CNT, produced in Barcelona in 1936. This image is available in the public domain. Our next episode will be out soon. Another collaboration, this time with the excellent Coffee with Comrades podcast and the brilliant Ruth Kinner, discussing her recent book, The Government of No One. Love and solidarity. Until next time.
Senhor Secretário de Estado, faz favor, tem a palavra. Senhor Presidente.